We may be living in what is considered a divisive time in American history, but most of the nation's past is fraught with conflict and concern. There are very few what you might call eras of good feeling in American history, where morale is high and division is limited. Welcome into the History Buffs Hub. In this video, we're going to take a look at the 4 true eras of good feelings in American history. Before we get started, please hit that like and subscribe button down below, and also ring the bell and turn on your notifications. Leave a comment, too. Give your opinions. History Buffs Hub wants to cover anything history related, from politics to sports to pop culture, but we can't do it without your help. I want to be clear up front, there were still serious problems and major injustices occurring during these times, and we'll address those. But in each of them, the majority felt good about the state of the nation. Now let's dive in. Number 1 was the literal era of good feelings. This began in 1815 under James Madison with the end of the War of 1812, which fueled patriotism and gave the young country credibility, and it peaked under James Monroe as the Federalist Party collapsed. No opposition party to divide the country, combined with a peacetime growing economy and the establishment of a second national bank, made everybody relatively happy. Literature and art distinct to America developed in this time, with people like Washington Irving and Thomas Cole, and public schools became more widespread, leading to a more involved and informed populace. People were so happy with this time period that they wanted to make sure there was no European involvement on the entire Western Hemisphere out of concern that the war culture of Europe would infect the peace and happiness of the United States. And that's what led to the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. Which declared any intervention by a European country in the political affairs in the Americas would be considered a hostile act towards the United States directly. Basically, people were saying we've built a perfect society. Let's make sure Europe doesn't screw it up like they do everything else. In 1820, Monroe ran unopposed and won, the last time any president in this country did that. However, the seeds for the end of this era were already laid. I'd mark the beginning of the end to be the Panic of 1819. The first widespread financial crisis in the US that came in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. Then came the McCulloch v. Maryland Supreme Court ruling, which affirmed the supremacy clause in the Constitution for the federal government over state governments. Both of these events generated opposition to the Second National Bank, which was related to both of them, and the quote-unquote common man saw it as an oppressive tool against his economic well-being. This only got worse with the Missouri Compromise, which was established after Missouri was admitted to the Union as a slave state in 1820, and to maintain the balance of power in the federal government between slave and free states, Maine was admitted as a free state. And then slavery was banned in the rest of the Louisiana Purchase territory north of latitude line 3630. These two events fueled the desire for greater participation by populists in the federal government and led to a dramatic increase in what you might call the white suffrage movement of the 1820s, where a greater portion of white non-landowners became allowed to participate in the electoral process, and many times their resentment toward minorities actually rolled back rights for those groups, including free black people who owned property. All of this led to the first populist movement in the US and the rise of Andrew Jackson and Jacksonian politics. The death knell for the era of good feelings was the corrupt bargain of 1824 that led to John Quincy Adams winning the presidency in a 4-way race, despite Jackson winning a plurality of the popular vote and electoral votes. It cemented the bitter split in the Democratic-Republican Party, and Jackson formed the Democratic Party, winning the presidential election in a comeback just 4 years later. There wasn't another era of good feeling for 100 years, as the increased political division over the Jacksonian era morphed into the bitter arguments over slavery in the antebellum era, which were followed by the Civil War, the violence of Reconstruction, the political turmoil of the Gilded Age and Progressive eras, and then World War I. The next era of good feeling was the 1920s, known as the Roaring Twenties, which ushered in a period of dramatic societal and cultural changes. It came on the heels of Woodrow Wilson's disastrous second term, which you can learn about here in my worst second terms in presidential history, linked to the video down below, and included US involvement in World War I, the Spanish flu epidemic, and the post-war depression of 1920. After the war ended in 1918, the pandemic ended in 1920, and Warren G. Harding became president in 1921 with a Republican trifecta where one party controls the House, Senate, and presidency. I'd mark the beginning of the Roaring Twenties to be 4 months into Harding's tenure, July of 1921, with the end of the post-war depression. America withdrew from the world stage, contrary to what Wilson wanted, but in line with what the public wanted, and still became a major power due to the aftermath of the war. New technology like the car, washing machine, and radios became accessible to the masses, and the shift away from farm life to city life ushered in a period of peacetime prosperity and dramatic lifestyle changes from one focused on survival to one focused on entertainment like jazz, fashion trends, parties, and architecture. We're talking about the period where Midtown Manhattan, where Times Square, the Plaza Hotel, and Central Park are, became the cultural hub for New York City rather than the business district of Wall Street. This was the decade of the Harlem Renaissance, where Harlem Manhattan became the cultural hub for African Americans thanks to the great migration of black people from the South to the North, and introduced the country to things like jazz music and so many other forms of African American art. It was also the period of the original influencers, where Condé Nast would use Vogue and Vanity Fair to tell everybody what the fashion trends were of the time. And it was the period of lavish parties and costumes. Increased accessibility to new technology like the car washing machine and radio were all part of this period, and that helped fuel the rise of interest in music, movies, and in particular, sports. Major League Baseball provides a snapshot of the transition from America in Wilson's second term to the Roaring Twenties. The sport was almost destroyed when Wilson was president due to the Black Sox scandal of 1919, when the Chicago White Sox threw the World Series. It became a primary source of entertainment for the masses though in the Roaring Twenties, largely thanks to the power hitting of Babe Ruth, who signing with the New York Yankees in 1920 marked the beginning of baseball's change from the small ball era, where the primary focus on offense was to move the runner over, to the home run era. This is when everybody learned that chicks dig the long ball. From a unity perspective, there wasn't much bitter partisanship. The Republicans controlled everything during this entire period, and not just Republicans, but the pro-business laissez-faire economic swing of the party that wrestled control from the progressives in 1912. Sure, the Solid South was still Democratic, but Democrats didn't win any state during this period in a presidential election that wasn't a border state or Confederate state, and in 1928, the Republicans actually made significant gains in the South, with Herbert Hoover winning every border state and 5 of the former Confederate states, plus Oklahoma, a former Confederate territory. Part of this was due to the emergence of the New South, which is another reason this was an era of good feeling. This was a movement that had existed since right after the Civil War, one that focused on industrializing the South and moving it away from its agrarian society, but young adults in the region, 2 generations removed from the Civil War, took this to a new level during the 20s, including embracing American football. Yes, before this time, football was by and large frowned upon in the South as a sport for those northeastern Yankee elites. All of this led to an explosion of new businesses and an increase in the stock market during this time. Americans increasingly bought things on credit to keep up with the trends, and generational wealth really took on a new meaning. People were taking out loans just to buy stock. I'd say the peak of this era was under Calvin Coolidge, who took over after Harding's death in 1923 and won his own election in 1924 and served through 1929 when Hoover replaced him. Its peak year was 1927, when Ruth hit 60 home runs as the Yankees won the World Series. The first feature-length film with synchronized dialogue, The Jazz Singer, was released, and Charles Lindbergh completed the first solo non-stop transatlantic flight. Now, like every era of good feeling, this one had a severe undercurrent of problems, most notably the fact that wealth inequality made many of these trends inaccessible for the masses. It also may have been the peak era of racism in the South, as Jim Crow law still raged, and the KKK was in its second era, where it reached its apex of power and controlled entire state governments in places like Alabama and even Indiana. That fueled anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic sentiment, which led to the Immigration Act of 1924, establishing ethnic quotas for immigrants to the country. Globally, you also had the growing threat of communism thanks to the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution during World War I and Joseph Stalin taking over the Soviet Union in 1924, and the rise of fascism in Western Europe, with Benito Mussolini taking over Italy in 1922 and the Nazis winning their first seat in Germany's Weimar Republic in 1928. Finally, there was prohibition, so you couldn't even drink. But overall, this period in the United States was one of high morale and a true belief in a better future. Unlike other eras though, this one didn't have a gradual end. The beginning of its end was the end of its end, and it hit its death knell pretty much overnight on October 29, 1929, known as Black Tuesday, when the stock market crash triggered the Great Depression, the worst economic crisis in human history. Hoover was elected 11 months earlier on the phrase "prosperity is just around the corner," which was a promise to the American public that they would all eventually share in the excess wealth created by the Roaring Twenties. But on Black Tuesday, a period of worldwide economic calamity began that included the complete wipeout of all the generational wealth created during that period and even resulted in starvation through much of the world. It ushered in a new party system for the United States government as the progressives coalesced behind the Democratic Party under Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1932, and the Democrats became the dominant political party for the next 50 years. Overseas, though, things went even worse, as the Depression resulted in the Nazis taking over Germany, Japan surrendering to imperialist rule, and all the stages being set for World War II. The Depression and World War II helped everybody see that the Roaring Twenties was entirely an illusion built on fraud. F. Scott Fitzgerald tried to make that case when he wrote The Great Gatsby during the Roaring Twenties in 1925, but nobody listened, and his book was released to poor reviews and poor sales. 2 decades later, his book became a bestseller, has spawned 3 movies, and is now required reading in many schools across the nation. It pretty much became a general consensus that Fitzgerald was right and everybody else was wrong. The third era of good feeling was the post-World War II economic boom. I'd argue this began right at the end of the war in September of 1945. The Allied victory that spurred the US into a global superpower that stood as the face of freedom in the West is how modern American pride peaked. The war also got the US out of the Depression as well. Soldiers came home to a much more booming economy than the one they left in the 1930s, and thanks to the social programs of the New Deal era, most notably the GI Bill that paid for housing and schooling for those who served, they also came home with a much greater net worth than they left with. Now, this era wasn't ushered in overnight like the other ones. It began with the end of the war and the booming economy, but there was a major supply shortage as well. This was due to all production efforts centering around supplies for the war, and before that, the Depression limited production anyway. As a result, inflation spiked and there was an insane housing shortage. President Harry Truman also had to deal with the outbreak of the Cold War, and he issued the Truman Doctrine, which declared that America would support efforts across the globe to fight the influence of communism from the Soviet Union. That was a messy affair too, most notably with the Korean War, which ended in a stalemate, and then the Red Scare. However, the plane did land, with a mass increase in housing construction, the country finding its footing with how to counter the Soviets, largely thanks to the creation of the CIA, and major income gains that eventually outpaced inflation due to the economic expansion from the US being the only industrialized country in the world able to produce anything, since it was the only one not destroyed by World War II. By the early 1950s, as Dwight Eisenhower became president, the post-war economic boom was in full swing. The majority of Americans became homeowners for the first time ever, and the American dream, a term coined in the early 1930s, became the reality for the majority of people. Cars, homes, and new electrical appliances to make life easier and more entertaining for people like refrigerators and televisions became the norm during this time. In many cases, a single income could provide for a family of 4 to 5 and pay for all of this. What really helped this era was a significant drop in crime as well, which was attributed to 2 things. One was the economic boom of the time, but the other was the low birth rate during the Depression, which meant that there just weren't that many people within the age range of the people who generally commit crimes, males in their teenage years and 20s. Simply put, there's a reason many look back on this time as the golden age of American capitalism. It led to the rise of rock and roll and new forms of entertainment. Again, though, it wasn't without major problems. Most notably, black people were still dealing with discrimination and Jim Crow laws in the South, and Mexican Americans suffered from a program with a phrase so racist, I won't say what it is, but it involved using military-style tactics to remove Mexican immigrants, some American citizens, out of the United States. Women's standing in society actually diminished from previous decades as the men coming home from battle took the jobs the women were holding down during the war. The expectation for women to get married and have children while the man provided actually increased beyond where it was in the 30s and 40s when everybody was trying to find work. And this form of social conservatism also hit the homosexual community, as Eisenhower issued an executive order firing many gay workers. A huge reason for this radical turn toward social conservatism was the idea that those who led alternative lifestyles were more likely to be sympathetic to communists, and that's another flaw of this era, the Red Scare. America began a witch hunt against anybody suspected of communism. This was most evident with the House Un-American Activities Committee, which was formed to blacklist famous people with suspected communist ties, and Senator Joe McCarthy literally creating a witch hunt by spending the first 4 years of the 1950s falsely accusing many people of being tied to the Communist Party. That Red Scare is why America embraced an idea of what social norms should be during this time and turned many of them to Christian nationalism, since communism was associated with atheism. And it's why "In God We Trust" became the official motto, while "Under God" was added to the Pledge of Allegiance. This was all ironically extremely hypocritical, because the whole point of opposing communism was a belief in individualism. That hypocrisy was not lost on authors like George Orwell, who wrote 1984 during this time, but the book that most eloquently captures the flaws of the era would be Catcher in the Rye. At the same time, the CIA's efforts to quote-unquote resist communist influence across the globe just led to them backing coups that overthrew democratically elected governments in Iran, Guatemala, and the Congo. So essentially, the US just became what it accused the Soviets of being. Still, domestically, there's no debate that the economic opportunities of the time lifted millions into the middle class and created a lifestyle for many to be desired. Unlike the Roaring 20s, this economy wasn't built on fraud either. The prosperity was much more evenly shared among everybody than in any other era and provided a mark of stability that no society in world history had ever seen. Nostalgia for the era was captured perfectly with shows like Leave It to Beaver, and the quality of life improved so greatly that the prospect of an American utopia truly seemed on the horizon. It's why so many people had kids, and so many of those kids actually grew up, since improved health dramatically reduced the infant mortality rate during this time, hence the baby boom of the era, and why this generation of kids was called the baby boomers. Although the era was mostly dominated by Democrats at the local and state level, the face of it is Eisenhower, a Republican president. Still, there wasn't much political division on the policy front, for better or worse. I'd say this era peaked in 1955, when the worst elements of McCarthyism and the Red Scare finally ended, inflation was less than 1% despite growth being over 7%, and the unemployment rate was steady in the low 4s. But the beginning of the end of this era took place ironically a year before the era peaked, with Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 sparking the Civil Rights Movement. That would dominate American politics for the next 10 years. While the Civil Rights Movement marked the beginning of the end of the era, the assassination of John F. Kennedy and the rise of the New Left in the mid-1960s marked the end of it. I'd mark its official end to be 1965 with Lyndon B. Johnson's dramatic increase in the draft for the Vietnam War. That coincided with the country becoming bitterly divided on the social issues of the time. The final era of good feeling for this country was the first half of the Reagan era. Most people would say this era began after the end of the Cold War, and that's certainly when it hit its stride, but I would actually say it began before the fall of the Berlin Wall, as communism was already fading. I would say we're still in the Reagan era, but this period coincides with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. After the cultural fights and anti-war movements of the 60s gave way to the corruption of the 1970s with Richard Nixon's resignation due to Watergate, and the period of stagflation in the late 70s, where interest rates and inflation were really high, but the economy was somehow in a recession, the optimistic American sentiment of the 1950s had evaporated. America's standing in the world seemed in question too with the Iranian Revolution and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Then Reagan was elected, and with it became the period of Reaganomics, the fall of the Soviet Union, and the increase in assets for the average American family. This period is marked by the childhoods that Gen X and millennials are so nostalgic over. It was the era of the mall culture, outbreak of cable television, and eventually the internet. Being able to watch movies not in the theater with the advent of VHS, Walkmans and CDs replacing cassette tapes, vinyl records, and 8-tracks, and a change in music from the rock and roll and disco era to hip-hop and alternative forms of rock defined this period. It's also when the rise of the gamer culture began, first with arcades, and then the rise of in-home video game systems. The sports world also had a dramatic growth in popularity, with the Super Bowl effectively becoming a national holiday, baseball still rolling and hitting a new level of fun in the late 90s with the home run chase, and the NBA becoming a major league in its own right, first with the Larry Bird-Magic Johnson rivalry of the 1980s, and Michael Jordan becoming the most universally beloved athlete in real time in the 1990s since Ruth was in the 1920s. It was the Wayne Gretzky era of the NHL, and professional wrestling also took off in popularity. Society was becoming more segmented, with networks for kids like Nickelodeon, sitcoms more for parents, and channels specifically for teenagers and young adults like MTV, but everybody was able to have their thing. Urban revival also happened during this time as well. New York City had transitioned from one with a bad reputation from crime in the 70s to the ultimate cosmopolitan hub of the 1990s. Another level of wealth was accumulated, this time by the boomer class, and the battles of the civil rights and feminist movements of the 60s and 70s seemed won. Integration was happening, black home ownership was rising, and women finally had basic rights like the ability to obtain a credit card. They also began to enter the workforce more. So social justice seemed to coincide with an economic boom, which restored faith in American culture for the vast majority of the country. The 90s has lots of parallels to the 1950s, and you can see all of that in my YouTube short on why Bill Clinton and Dwight Eisenhower had such similar presidencies. There's a reason many of the nostalgic shows and comic strips from the 1950s, like Leave It to Beaver, Dennis the Menace, and The Little Rascals, all had movies made in the 1990s. Heck, even Disney made a comeback, as this was the Disney Renaissance era, with big movies like The Little Mermaid, Lion King, Aladdin, and Beauty and the Beast, which rivaled one of the peak eras of Disney, which was during the 50s. I'd say this era officially began in 1983, when the late 70s recession officially ended. Over the rest of the decade, GDP soared while inflation rates, interest rates, and unemployment collapsed. Boomers in the corporate world who were starting families may have had to take out mortgages at high interest rates in the 70s, but the homes were cheap, and after the interest rates fell in the 80s, their home values exploded, so many of them were able to refinance and saw their own net worth explode to a level that was never seen before. This increase in wealth coincided with people working more white-collar jobs, seemingly less stressful to say the least, and was also a huge part of the majority of high school graduates being able to enroll in college, a first in U.S. history. It was only more solidified with the Cold War ending in 1991 as the USSR dissolved under George H.W. Bush, but there's no doubt that this era peaked under Bill Clinton after the early 90s recession ended. Some historians actually called this era the end of history during the time, the belief that the US had perfected capitalism and democracy with the fall of the Soviet Union, and that the rest of the world would naturally follow suit. There seemed to be nothing more needed to fight for. Probably the best year for the era was 1998. When the US recorded its first budget surplus in decades, unemployment was low, home ownership was hitting record highs, and the country was in the midst of the largest period of peacetime expansion in history. Internet access was rapidly increasing too, and the country was on the cusp of a majority of homes being connected to the World Wide Web. It's also the year Clinton was impeached over a sex scandal, and that's one of the ironic parts about this period: the growth of partisanship and political division. This era came with the explosion of the war on drugs and mass incarceration, while wages stagnated and did not keep pace with the economy. Many businesses and towns were hollowed out due to new technology and more international trade, and the US becoming much more of a service-based economy rather than a production-based economy set the stage for the economic issues we see today. I'd consider 9/11 to be the beginning of the end of this era. That sparked the global war on terror and a US foreign policy that has since become an extremely hot-button topic. Being attacked like that on their own soil was an incredible shock to the system of the country that enjoyed a period of relative long peace and prosperity for about 20 years, with a couple of recessions that were minor in between. However, people were still largely happy with the state of the country even after the attacks. The division over the years, though, via unpopular wars in the aftermath of 9/11 and the growing economic anxiety, began to erode the high morale, and its death knell was the 2008 financial crisis, which wiped out so much generational wealth that people had worked to build for decades. That crisis, in many ways, revealed the whole era to be built on an illusion, the same way the Depression exposed the Roaring '20s. To this day, the country has not undone the damage of that financial crisis and the economic pain that came with it. Even as the economy had seemingly fully recovered on paper in the late 2010s, access to the American dream was still getting harder and harder by the year. That hasn't changed, and the American dream now seems like nothing more than just that, a dream for younger millennials and Gen Zers. Heck, many Gen Xers never saw the wealth they lost from the financial crisis come back, and they're now nearing retirement age. All of this has only fueled resentment in American politics, creating even more divisiveness and dramatic electoral swings. No society at any point will ever be without flaws, but there's no denying the rot and morale that has plagued the country in recent years. Eventually, the fever will break and another era of good feeling will arrive, but none of us know what that will look like, who will usher it in, or what the issues of that era will be. Thanks for hopping into the History Buffs Hub to watch this video. What do you consider to be the happiest period in American history? Please tell us in the comments, and once again, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button for more history videos in the future.